Chapter 15. To each a trade. The idea of apprenticeship was a term that seemed to hark from the Middle Ages, but here was this opportunity for Tina, for us, and we accepted it. I think it was one of the best decisions we made as a family, but it was hard, real hard. Watching her leave was hard for me and hardest by far for David. But we were facing a bleak, cold winter. A late start to the spring planting, along with a freak frost in mid-May, had wiped out all of the fruit tree harvest, and a freak cold snap in late August had wiped out most of our remaining crops. We were in bad shape and we knew it. So we said our goodbyes, watched her walk away with her hand firmly in Penelope's, and hoped we would all survive our first winter apart. Jess's journal. Jess didn't like the smell of the lamb's ear. She had cut the dried dead flower spikes off of the plants and began trying to extract the seeds. Jess had done this with all of the plants currently in the garden. So far, she had managed to harvest hundreds of sage seeds. The sage hadn't bothered Jess a bit, but David had run out of the house, protesting the strong scent and howling that his eyes were burning. It was early September, yet the days were still quite warm. The sun beat down and there was a light breeze, keeping it from being unbearably hot. Everyone was busy with something, making use of the slightly cooler weather to get a long list of needed tasks done. At the moment, it was almost impossible to imagine the impending winter. The tomatoes were still producing, and the apples that had escaped the late frost were just about ready to harvest. David had announced he would be clearing an area on the other side of the block where they hoped to start a new orchard and plant the 10 small apple trees he had helped Mr. Banks graft last year. There were also a large number of peach and cherry trees that Jacob and Tina had planted as seeds, which were now in their second year of growth and ready to be transplanted as well. They had all headed over to the area that morning and were clearing areas of weed cover and prepping the soil. That left Aaron and Jess and Quincy behind. Aaron sat quietly next to Jess, her red hair shining in the sun. It was curly, just as Aaron's had been. Sometimes Jess found herself wanting to believe that she was Aaron, or even Aaron's daughter, a piece of her best friend come back to her, a piece she could keep close. She had seen her friend die, but it didn't matter, she still caught herself hoping for a different reality. The little girl was so quiet, still mute, unlike her namesake in so many ways, yet Jess loved having her near. The child had a gentle, kind spirit, which spoke louder than words ever could. Jess also harvested the dried pods from the kale plants that had flowered. She had uncovered a garden 3 houses down beneath a dense carpet of weeds and discovered a persistent kale plant in the mix. That little gem had yielded hundreds of seeds. She had planted handfuls of kale seeds in areas close to the chicken coop, where the chickens could feast on them. Then she had planted long rows of kale 2 houses down, which still had a privacy fence mostly in place. The flock never strayed too far from their coop, and hidden behind the tall fence, the rows of kale grew thick and lush. The plants would be perfect for adding to salads and soups, and for trade as well, since most of the townspeople still seemed to be in a rut of growing the tried and true vegetables without thought to nutritional powerhouses like kale. She didn't know what to do with all of these lamb's ear seeds, didn't even know if it was worth her time to do this, but she persevered. Jess gathered every seed she saw come available. Basil looked to be next, and some lettuce that had bolted in the rows next to the kale. She wrote on scraps of paper and shoved the drying plants into bowls, boxes, anything that would hold them. She sat on the front stoop, slowly picking at the stalks of lamb's ear, trying not to breathe through her nose. The flower stalks of the plant had an odd smell that made her almost nauseous. The smell seemed to bother Erin equally. She wrinkled up her nose and made a face at Jess, which made her laugh out loud. Quincy let out a small whine and one short bark. This usually meant that someone familiar was approaching the house. Jess looked up, surprised to see a stranger approaching. The woman looked to be in her late 40s with slim, long legs, and she was tall. Her hair was long, straight, and dark, and she had it braided in one thick rope down the middle of her back. Her temples showed gray, as did one long streak that ran the length of her long hair. Despite the cool fall day, she was wearing shorts and a sleeveless tank top with a durable rucksack resting on her shoulders. She met Jess's gaze and smiled, raised her hand in greeting. "Hello there. You must be Jessica Aronson." She reached down and scratched the dog's ears. "And this must be Quincy." Quincy licked the woman's hand, then settled down at Jess's feet again, her tail a steady thump against the ground. Her latest litter of puppies squirmed on a blanket nearby, mainly sleeping, and Quincy didn't seem alarmed at all by the stranger. Jess had long since come to rely on her dog's instincts. She had found them to be quite accurate. Still, Jess knew nothing about this strange woman, but she already seemed to know a great deal about Jess and her little family. Hello." It sounded lame as it came out. Who was this woman? "I'm Penelope," the woman said, sticking her hand out to shake Jess's. Jess fumbled with the lamb's ear and quickly stood up to shake Penelope's hand. "I see you're collecting lamb's ear seeds." Her eyes were a dark brown color, full of warmth, as she asked, "Do you work with other herbs?" Jess nodded and did not elaborate. The truth of the matter was that the lamb's ear, along with the basil and some other herb seeds she could barely identify, would probably be handed over to Tina. Despite being just 10 years old, the girl had become a font of knowledge. Penelope smiled. "Do you know anything about the properties of lamb's ear, Jess?" "Only that it's making me feel sick to my stomach. I don't like the weird smell." The woman laughed then, and it was soft and free. "Stop for a while and I'll take over. I've gotten used to it." She sat down on the stoop, took the bucket from Jess and began plucking at the dry flower heads. Jess could hear the intermittent scatter of seeds as they fell and hit the bottom of the bucket. "The leaves can be picked early, before it flowers, and can be dried and used in tea. You could also eat it in salads or steamed, but most people object to the furry aspect of it. The best use of lamb's ear is for small wound care. It is absorbent and soft and plentiful. But that isn't why I came here." She finished with one stalk and started on another. "I've come to speak with you and David about Tina and a possible apprenticeship." Jess looked at her, trying to gauge whether the woman was joking. "Tina's only 10 years old." Penelope's hands didn't stop moving as she turned toward Jess and gave her a long, appraising look. She had spent time in the heart of town, talking to Sarah Turner. She had described Jess as the go-to person for information on the town and its residents. After a few days of trade and work, Penelope knew enough of the girl's history to know that she and her house full of kids had struggled through some pretty tough times in the past 6 years. Sarah Ann had been pretty forthcoming with details about Jess, informing her that Jess was busy writing down the lives and accounts of most of the residents of Belton and compiling a history of the area. "She goes from house to house, usually during the winter when there's not so much to do," Sarah Ann had said. "She writes down whatever memories they have, of this war, of their families, of the time before. Whatever someone wants to talk about, really." The woman had shrugged. "I wasn't born here, but she even wanted my story." Penelope had been as circumspect as possible. She had been searching a long time for the author of the letter she had found in the cave. She was sure, however, that this Jess Aronson was the one that had seen Mom through her final days and buried her in the cairn outside her beloved cave. If you are reading this, then you undoubtedly know Madge. My name is Jess Aronson. I'm 16 years old. The letter was crumpled and tattered now, worn from reading and rereading it over and over. Well, I've heard from Dr. Ridley that she knows a lot about herbs and healing. She smiled and turned back to the lamb's ear. I've also come for a different reason. I've been looking for you for a long time now, nearly 5 years. You see, you knew someone very important to me. She let Jess digest this in a long moment of silence. Jess's fear was rising slowly. This woman wasn't a soldier. She had no weapons. Could she have come from the camp? Her memories of Tent 5 and the camp haunted her dreams each night. But her days had been bright and full of love for long enough that she had learned to cope with the nightly terrors. Penelope must have sensed her fear as she stopped and said, I'm sorry. I didn't tell you my full name. It's Penelope Fallingwater Astor. Dr. Madeline Fallingwater? You may have known her as Madge. She was my mother. Oh my God, Grandmother Madge, Jess couldn't put the words together, and the tears came then. Penelope watched her for a moment. She had read the letter so many times, but she still had her doubts. Had this girl and the other children truly loved her mother? Had Madge been at peace, surrounded by anyone who may have cared for her? Had they said the prayers the old woman's spirit required in order to find peace in the hereafter? Watching Jess now, it seemed that the letter had spoken true. Before I tell you how your friend or mother died, I want to tell you how she lived. How she gave us sanctuary and saved our lives by leading us here to this cave. The 4 of us, my newborn son Jacob, David, and Tina, both orphans from Clinton, and I have been here since September. Penelope reached out and hugged Jess to her as tears began to slide down her nose. David found them that way a few minutes later and just stood and stared at the 2 sobbing women. A moment later, Tina also wandered up and took in the scene. I am sure I do not need to tell you how special Madge was, or how much she came to mean to us. I lost my best friend in the world just days before she found us. I couldn't think. I was scared and lost. What's going on? Who is she? Tina asked her brother. He just shrugged and kept staring at Jess and Penelope. Tina's voice, however, was enough to reduce the crying and elicit some basic explanation of who Penelope was. This was followed immediately with an invitation to dinner. 2 hours later, the sun had slipped low on the horizon and dusk was gathering. Penelope's husband, Kip, had joined them, and they had just finished nibbling the last kernels of corn off the cob. Penelope had been fascinated by little Erin, who at nearly 4 years of age was in a growth spurt and had lost most of her babyish looks. The young girl was slender and pixie-like, her freckled skin slightly sunburnt and her hair a mass of bright red curls. She still did not speak, and Jess wondered about it from time to time. Would she ever? She had been with the family for just over 6 months and was obviously happy with everyone. She understood what was asked of her, nodded, smiled, and shook her head when she disagreed, but she never spoke a single word, except for the occasional giggle when David tickled her. As dinner wrapped up, there was a quiet silence that descended upon the group. Penelope looked at the bunch of them and marveled at their resilience. Jess was tall and graceful. Her skin was tanned a golden brown from working in the sun, and her hair fell in long curls down the middle of her back. David was in his mid to late teens, and his arms and chest were muscled and lean. They had served some stew with turkey and wild greens in it, and Jess had pointed to David, noting that he was the one who had landed them the turkey using his bow. It was the same bow that Grandmother Madge had taught him to use. The end was peaceful. We were with her, holding her hands, and my baby Jacob nestled beside her. She loved to hold him, and he adored her. We all did. The sun had slipped down beyond the horizon. Pink and red streaks colored the clouds. The crickets had begun to sing, and the evening had a chill. They'd spent hours describing their time with Grandmother Madge in the cave. Penelope and Kip had asked many questions, Kip especially, amazed that they had all spent a winter there. As dinner wound down, they had put a pot of chicory coffee on to boil, sweetened it with the sugar beets Jess had cultivated in the yard 2 houses down. They had expanded their gardens to several yards, those they identified as having good soil, and others that simply had intact tall fences. Especially when it came to foods that deer liked, the high fences had been effective in keeping out the local deer population that was exploding in spite of regular hunting. "Grandmother Madge said you were in Europe, or was it Africa?" Jess asked, dying to hear about the outside world. "How did you get here?" Penelope and Kip's faces grew grim. They glanced at each other for a moment, and Penelope held out her mug to Kip for a refill. He was nearest the coffee pot. "That has been an adventure, let me tell you. Have any of you heard much of what is going on in the outside world, outside of the former United States?" She asked Jess and David. The word former raised David's hackles a little. What did she mean, former? They were still the United States, weren't they? Jess answered, "We heard that the collapse spread past our borders, that it was kind of like a domino effect. First the economic collapse, and then multiple civil wars and uprisings in places like Greece, the Middle East, even China after the US dollar collapsed." She dug into old memories from before the invasion by the Western Front. "There were a lot of problems with the euro before the collapse, but afterwards," she shrugged. "We lost power and internet, and my parents stopped talking about what was happening out there." She stared into the gathering darkness. Maybe it was too big, too frightening even for them. And then afterwards, after I returned with David and Tina and Jacob, well, we haven't exactly welcomed outsiders in Belton until more recently. The world has changed, I'm sure, but we only know what is nearby. There have been plenty of false starts into reasserting government on a broader level, but nothing that's stuck. She gestured toward the town center. We have a militia, a mayor. For whatever they are worth, murmured David in disgust. Jess shot him a glance. And a basic town government in place. Every so often someone gets their britches in a knot and wants something more, and starts talking about money and taxes and the federal government. That doesn't last long. Penelope nodded. When the United States collapsed, much of the world was already on the brink of complete chaos. The riots in Greece were just the beginning of what became an uprising. Civil war, and eventually a full war through Europe. She gave a dark laugh. Even Switzerland couldn't sit this one out. And Africa had already been a hotbed, right along with the Middle East, so much infighting along with the scourge of HIV, and so many young people growing up without any parents, without any direction in their lives. She took a sip of the dark, heavily sweetened chicory and continued. We were traveling with an independently funded humanitarian aid mission in Uganda. The Lord's Resistance Army controlled much of the north at the time. The word got out that every American had better get out now or else. Her face had a wry look. As if it were that easy. Her husband, Kip, who had said little until this point, took up the story. It took us nearly 2 years just to get out of Africa. Everything that could break down did. Communications, monetary systems, and the American embassies, or any embassies friendly to United States interests, were either closed, burned to the ground, or abandoned. The fact that we were Americans was suddenly a very bad thing. Luckily, we had friends, those who had been helped by our organization, by us. We stayed with a string of them until it became dangerous for them to keep us there. We eventually found our way to the Mediterranean and tried to enter Europe via Italy and later Spain. He shook his head. Penelope continued. It seemed that all of Europe was either involved in the uprisings, civil war, or fighting each other. More than anything, though, any Americans were turned away. We ended up with several others from our aid group on a freighter, bound for Port-au-Prince. It was the closest thing we had to the U.S. Although anyone we spoke to told us there had been nukes set off in the south, and there were plenty of pointed fingers. She took another sip of the chicory, now cooled in the mug, and continued. In the end, we don't know how it started, or who pushed what buttons, but there were nuclear detonations recorded in Austin, D.C., and Los Angeles. It looks as if the Star Wars defense program took out most of the satellites in space at right around the same time, effectively ending worldwide communications. David remembered some of the talk, overheard through closed doors and muffled conversations between his parents. Hearing it so clear, so real from two people had experienced it, it was surreal. Jess remembered more, and hearing Kip and Penelope describe it brought back the memories of the internet, intermittent, and her father shouting about the nuke in Austin before everything went down for good. Penelope stared at the bottom of her cup, her vision clouded by the events that came next. Kip waited for her to speak, and then he continued the story. We knew the chances of finding Madge were unlikely. There had been such chaos in the cities, we wondered if she ever even made it out. Not to mention that she had told Penelope and her other children of her illness and that she didn't have long. Penelope had been scheduling a trip back to the States when everything went to hell. We just didn't hold out much hope. We stayed in Haiti for nearly 18 months, trying to stay alive and figure out where to go next. Penelope sat there for a moment, her eyes and mind miles away, lost in memories of Haiti. She didn't want to tell them of the disease, the murders, or how many times they had fought for just enough food to survive. She didn't want to talk about the children she saw lying dead in the streets. Penelope roused herself. Florida was impossible. There were nearly a dozen naval bases there that banded together once communications with D.C. ceased. They patrol the waters and allow no one in. It's a fire first, ask questions later situation. We couldn't get close enough to tell them we were American. Not that it would have mattered. They had locked it down to Florida residents anyway. Texas was a fallout zone, as was much of the Caribbean and the southern states. She pursed her lips. Not that they told Florida citizens that. They were actively denying it even after the first reports of radiation sickness. Once the Western Front started moving east into the Plains states, other factions of former military, along with extremists, rose up to define their own areas of control. Kip chimed in. The Allied South struggled to consolidate Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. Mexico had surged into Arizona, New Mexico, and the most southern section of California, and there was chaos there. Lines drawn between the white, Hispanic, and Native American populations. The drug cartels made a move for power. The East Coast had 3 different contingents, the Northern Allies, who were struggling to define the borders of a half a dozen small states, the Unionists that controlled some part of the Southeast, and the Patriots, who were hopelessly divided through infighting in Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana. Even Jacob and Becca, who understood little of the states being discussed, having been born after the collapse, were silent. Erin, just 4 years old, had curled up in David's arms and was sucking her thumb, listening intently to Kip and Penelope's account. Penelope continued, "We finally found entry just west of Biloxi, Mississippi. There had been a radiation fallout scare and much of the area was deserted. We headed up Highway 49. After that, it was a zigzag route. We entered Tennessee, tried to go through the northwest section, but there were a chain of small towns, all with militias, and we were turned back at Tiptonville." She took another sip. "The Western Front had torn through that region, and everyone was on edge. If you weren't a resident, they turned you away, no questions, no argument." She smiled wryly. "After all, they were the ones with the guns. You can't argue much with the business end of a gun." Kip spoke. "We spent a winter in Arkansas. There were migrant groups moving through the areas, many of them working crops, building, or reinforcing town borders, living like gypsies as they searched for a place to stay. We moved in and out of those groups. Diseases we hadn't seen in decades in the Western world ran rampant. Cholera, bouts of dysentery, and a host of other illnesses could be found in any group we joined. But the alternative was to go it alone, without some of the protection a group could provide. Sometimes it was worth it, other times it wasn't." Penelope spoke. "And eventually we moved through parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and then finally Missouri. Once we hit Missouri, I was determined to find my mother. I had thought about it a lot, wondering what she would do, where she would go, if she knew she only had a short time to live. I doubted that she would have stayed in her home there in Kansas City, and we were close to the archaeology site she had been working on for the last few years. I had been given the opportunity to visit the site the first year they had begun work, so I was familiar with where to find it. I figured if she wasn't there, I could try finding her in KC. I wasn't holding out much hope either way." She paused, drained the last of the chicory from her cup, and said, "I noticed the cairn immediately. When we arrived at the cave, I was convinced that the full team had to have been there, since there was evidence of more than just Mom. It took me a while to go deeper into the cave. I was wondering where everyone went, even though it was obvious it had been a while. I had completely forgotten about the long passage. Finding your letter, even as it raised more questions, gave me some measure of peace." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "She wasn't alone when she passed. That means so much to me to know that she had someone with her as she passed into the world of spirits." She wiped at a tear that had escaped and began trickling down her cheek. "And eventually we came here looking for you, Jess." Jess realized that her own cheeks were wet with tears. The few months they had spent with Madge had been beautiful ones. The old woman had given her so much: love, acceptance, and peace. Even now, 6 years later, she remembered it like it was yesterday, just when her faith in humans and life in general had been so sorely tested. Madge had reminded her of all she had to live for, all that she could be for Jacob, the others, and for herself. Healing during those months in the cave had allowed her to have some trust in others again. She had emerged from the cave as more than just a ghost filled with grief over the loss of her friend Erin. Grandmother, that is what she asked us to call her, took us in and taught us how to survive here, in this cave through the winter. It is now March, late March, and no snow has fallen in several weeks. The temperatures are rising, and it is time for me to try to finish my journey home. I have her journal, the personal one that she kept, Jess remembered suddenly. I can get it for you. Penelope held up a hand. Tomorrow. Can I come again tomorrow? The sun had set, and the darkness had closed in. We are staying in town. That they let us at all was a surprise, but apparently the militia is allowing traders and migrant workers in these days, so we will be here for another day or perhaps 2. Jess nodded. Yes, of course. Come by tomorrow. They said their goodbyes, and she watched Penelope and Kip walk away into the darkness. It was a new moon in the sky, and the darkness seemed overwhelming as they disappeared into the night. She gave a small start when David put his hand on her shoulder. She wants something, doesn't she? He asked, his voice quiet in the gloom. Yeah. Jess didn't know how to say it better. She wants Tina. What? David sounded outraged, and he looked as though he was ready to run after the couple and confront them. Jess hastily explained. There's a group of doctors, healers working together in the city, or what's left of Kansas City, to create a new learning center for the healing arts. Sarah Turner told her about us, about Tina, and Penelope says it would be an apprenticeship. She grabbed his sleeve. They are coming back tomorrow. We will learn more about them then, okay? Let's not jump to any decision right now. They seem all right, and you can say no, but at least hear them out. It might actually be a chance for Tina to become a doctor, someone necessary, a future she might want. David pulled away. She isn't your sister, Jess. You can't just make this decision for her, or for me. His tone was defensive, even bitter. Jess felt a surge of pain. They'd spent years together, and she loved Tina just as much as she loved David or Jacob. Of course not. I'm not trying to make a decision for her. I'm just saying we should listen to what they say. David walked in the opposite direction, away from where Penelope and Kip had headed into town, away from the house and Jess. She watched him go, feeling hurt and defensive. She knew he had a right to his feelings, but his abrupt departure wounded her. The last thing in the world she wanted to do was suggest that she wanted Tina to go away. I don't know you, and you don't know me, but I'm writing this letter and then hiding the box where only someone who knows Madge and inner twists and turns of this cave will be able to find it. I have to be sure, you see. It still isn't safe. They have sent out soldiers hunting for us, and I don't know that they aren't still out there looking. The next day, David seemed better. They had worked on the house, repairing a section of the roof and then weeding several of the beds of potatoes and lettuce. Jess had made up her mind to tell Penelope they weren't interested, that Tina was far too young. What possible apprenticeship could apply to a young child? As she watched Penelope approach, her long-legged stride fluid on the broken pavement of the street, Jess could see that Sarah Turner had joined her and that Penelope's husband, Kip, was not with them. Sarah was a kind woman. She'd always treated Jess as an equal, and during those first months and years, she had championed the young woman's cause and that of their motley group of children more than once. Sarah was quite protective, in fact, which made Jess wonder about the older woman's past, and that of her children, who were nearly the same age as Jess. Sarah had always been rather close-mouthed about where she had come from, or where Cody and Laura's father was. What would Sarah have to contribute to all of this? Jess wasn't sure what to think. A quick glance at David's face signaled trouble. Tina was his sister, and he had a right to his opinion. But for the first time, Jess wondered what Tina wanted. Stay or go? Wasn't it up to her? After all, Tina was nearly the age that David had been when they all first met in Clinton. He had been old enough to make a decision then, a decision that had taken him away from everything familiar, everything that reminded him of home. Shouldn't Tina have the right to make that same decision, even at the age of 10 years? Jess was conflicted, and she knew it showed in her face. Sarah took it in, smiled at her, and gave her a warm hug. "Good morning, Jess." Since her daughter Laura had married Todd Stevens, the laugh lines on her face had deepened. The births of Laura and Todd's 2 boys had brought happiness, along with something Jess could only describe as longing to Sarah's face. Jess wondered if Sarah was thinking of the husband she had left behind. Jess had listened to so many stories, so many unfinished, unknown fates of loved ones. It was perhaps the most haunting part of her job as historian, the unknown fates of so many. Sarah's story was one of dozens. It was hours before dinner, and they had had lunch just 2 hours earlier, but Sarah produced a loaf of her sourdough bread, a favorite of David's. That was combined with a bag of fruits that Kip had sent along, payment for some picking work they had both done earlier in the day. Jess and David, along with Tina, Sarah, and Penelope, sat down for a bite to eat and some conversation. It was stilted at first, mainly due to David, who felt cornered and resentful. Jess laid her hand on his knee, reminding him silently that she was his ally. He stared at her hand as she made small talk with Penelope and Sarah, concentrated on the long, tapered fingers. They were rough, with calluses, but still delicate. He looked at them and tried to calm his fears of losing his sister, knowing how much she wanted to go. Tina had come to him that morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, and quietly folded herself on the floor of his room. Quietly, so she didn't wake Jacob. Her room was right next door, shared with Becca and Aaron, when one or the other wasn't curled in bed next to Jess. "I want to go with her," was all that she had said when he opened one bleary eye and focused on her. They'd engaged in a silent contest of wills, him glaring, her just staring back, until he had finally turned away and pulled the covers over his head and tried to ignore her. When he had turned back over a few moments later, she was gone. The small talk had progressed while he was wool gathering. Penelope was describing her mother's house in Kansas City. "It's over 130 years old and solid brick. Surprisingly, it's rather intact considering the dire situation that most residents were in before and during the collapse. Most of her books are still there." Penelope smiled at Jess. She wrote about all kinds of recent history, as well as anthropology. She had quite an obsession with Jesse James, and also had notes on Pendergast, a corrupt political boss in the early 20th century. She turned toward David, who just shrugged and shook his head. He had never heard of Jesse James or Pendergast. In any case, the house was gone through, but not much was taken, and it was empty when we visited it last week. We are planning to stay there and work with a medical group that is forming. She looked at Tina and smiled at her, then back to David, where her smile faltered a brief second. If it would be all right, Tina could come with us to Kansas City and stay in the house. There's plenty of room, and there are other students who she would be learning side by side with. You could come too, David, to see for yourself if you liked. A long silence ensued. All eyes were on David until Tina spoke up. "I want to go to Kansas City with you, Penelope. I want to learn how to be a doctor. It's all I've ever wanted to do." David closed his eyes for a moment, remembering her tiny hand in his, her matted hair in those weeks and months that had followed the deaths of their parents. The feel of her tiny body nestled against his. He remembered farther back, the first time he had seen her in the hospital. A tiny red face, impossibly small, mewling cries that sounded like a tiny, sad kitten. They had never fought. With nearly 8 years between them, he had always been the oldest, the one she looked up to. And when they had been alone, lost in the rubble of a dead and broken town, she had depended on him for everything. It was only here, in Belton, that she had come into her own, as young as she was, defining her future, writing it on the wall with nothing short of indelible marker. Her abilities, her intuitive understanding and curiosity of the healing arts had given her this opportunity. And who was he to say no? How could he? David thought of her being absent, not someone he saw every day, not in the garden or walking into town with freshly picked herbs for Dr. Ridley, and something deep in his chest twisted and pulled. She was all that he had of their former life, the only evidence he could show of the parents he had lost. The words to say all that seemed to elude him. In the end, he simply stared at Jess's hand, still on his knee, and said, "If Tina wants to go, then I guess that's what she should do. But if you find this, know that she died surrounded by people who loved her. She was at peace, and I miss her dreadfully. Yours, Jess." Jess, David, and the kids stood there for a long time the next morning and watched Tina walk away, her tiny hand in Penelope's, Kip alongside her. They watched until all three became dark specks that simply disappeared over the horizon.